I'm Professor Suzannah Lipscomb. I'm a historian, author and broadcaster, and I'm the host of the Not Just the Tudors podcast from HistoryHit.
It's hard not to be interested in the witch hunt. Tens of thousands of people were believed to be in league with the devil, conjuring up storms, killing livestock, and maiming their neighbors through evil magical power. This idea was so credible that the educated elites of society, even a king, believed it too, and, shockingly, allowed the suspects to be tried through courts of law and face capital punishment if found guilty. So says Professor Suzannah Lipscomb, an expert on the subject of witches. And she joins us today. I am delighted to welcome Professor Suzannah Lipscomb to the podcast. I have been a huge fan for years and had a wonderful opportunity back in 2017 to join her for a week-long tour about Henry VIII and learned so much and made some friends that I'm still friends with, and it's just terrific. Then I got to hear Suzannah in person again in 2019, and it is an absolute thrill to welcome her to the podcast. As I'm sure you all know, she is a historian, author, broadcaster, host of Not Just the Tudors, a wonderful podcast, and an award-winning professor of history at the University of Roehampton. Her research in the 16th century, and she's at 16th Century Girl, is both English and French history. And one of the things I love is that she wrote about Henry VIII's Annus Horribilis in her book 1536, which is one of my introductions to her and her wonderful work. She's gone on to write all kinds of things about women's lives and faith and marriages and sexuality in 16th century France, and recently, and it's not quite out in the States yet, but with Helen Carr edited the What is History Now, which is just something I am looking forward to getting my hands on. And she also writes frequently for History Today, and I'm sure many of you have also just watched Walking Through Tudor England, which is such a treat. So thank you so much for joining us, Suzannah.
Carol Ann, thank you for that ridiculously fulsome introduction. And I am delighted to be here. And I am also a fan of yours, and I like to think also a friend. So it is a real joy to be here.
Well, it is just a treat for me, and I'm thrilled. So one of the things that I think is wonderful with your range of things, and it is October, and so we are sort of looking at witches, and you have explored witches and witchcraft. I have right here. I'm sort of surrounded by your books. And let me just say, if you ever want a real treat, just surround yourself with Suzannah's books. But there's that wonderful Ladybird book, on witches. And then I recently watched again the 2-part series on witches, which is currently on Netflix. For any of you who have that, that's worth a look. And you talk about witches in your podcast. What is it about witches that draws you and fascinates you?
Yes, it's funny. Actually, I'm joining you today in the midst of writing a review of 2 books about witches. So I'm thinking about witches all the time at the moment. What is it about witches? I think the thing about witchcraft is that it is something that means that we confront the past in all its strangeness. So we have these moments where people are accusing their neighbors of being witches on the basis of things like storms or cows getting sick or unexplained illnesses, children dying, and other mysterious occurrences. And it really goes to the heart of relations between neighbors, people living in very close-knit communities and depending on each other, and then getting envious and fearful and resentful towards each other, and how that manifests. And so the testimonies can tell us a lot about ordinary life, and I find that really fascinating. They allow us, when we look at the depositions of those tried for witchcraft, we can have a look at, the stuff of ordinary life, and we can kind of feel our way back into our ancestors' experiences of the world. but it also goes to those emotions I mentioned. Envy comes up a lot, guilt, fear. It's also at the heart of how people thought about women, because a lot of it's to do with the witch as an anti-mother, as someone who would, bewitch children, or who was envious of fertile mothers. And I suppose so much of it, therefore, allows us a glimpse into a completely different way of seeing the world, and requires us to kind of throw off our own assumptions and prejudices about this being kind of hysteria or fraud or delusion, and actually to see it as they saw it, which is something actually very real and very menacing.
Oh, I think that's great. And the idea that it plunges us sort of into their world in the life of ordinary people, because witchcraft sort of seems to run the gamut from ordinary people up through, we'll talk later about particular queens who might have been accused of witchcraft, but it does plunge us into that real notion. And we hear the voices of these people, which I think is really interesting. And there is sort of a steady beat of witchcraft throughout centuries. You see these pockets of places, but there's a dramatic sort of shift with witch hunts and trials and executions over a period of, I guess, about 300 years. Can you tell us a little bit about what sort of seems to kick that off, or what contributes to the sudden surge in not just fear, but an attempt to prosecute these witches and ultimately execute witches?
Yes, and actually I'd say it perhaps is even shorter than 300 years. I think we've got the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of the Witches, published in the 1490s. Salem, which is the sort of last great case, is in 1692, of course. So at most 200 years, but I would actually even whittle it down to say it's probably the best part of 100, where we've got really a sort of great number of cases in the late 16th and 17th centuries. And Salem's happening when many other places have stopped trying witches. And why it happens is a question that historians have trying to solve for a long time. It seems to be a kind of perfect storm. Some of it literally is about storms, insofar as this is a period known as the Little Ice Age in Europe, when temperatures drop dramatically and weather conditions are bad. There are plagues, there are there's influenza, there's terrible harvests and famine. One failed harvest means hunger, but if you get two or more in a row, you leads into severe dearth. So there's that sort of stuff which is hard to control, and yet contributes to an atmosphere of anxiety, really, I suppose, a sort of low-level hump, and which we will all now be familiar with, having gone through the experience of the pandemic. We know how it kind of used up some of our mental bandwidth because we were just concerned about that. So imagine that. And then children died a lot when they were young, in infancy at this point in time. It's before they're having any of their vaccinations for diphtheria or whatever it is. And so there's a lot of infant death, which of course is creating a sense of anguish and fear. And as I said, witches often are thought to be older women who are anti-mothers. There's a kind of sense of fear around menopausal and postmenopausal women, that they are no longer fertile and therefore thought to be envious of those who are. And Linda Roper's done some very good work in her book, for example, Witch Craze, looking at how witches are predominantly women, not only women, crucially. About 4/5 of those accused of witchcraft are women. But among those, they are predominantly older than 40, between about 40 and 70. So we're both for it, I'm afraid, Caroline. And also it's to do with things like the Reformation, and a sense that the devil was at work. The people felt that they were living in the end days. There was a sense of apocalypse. They felt that the devil was abroad, and that he could be found at work in everyday life, either through sending his familiars, which are sort of devilish imps, which is what happens in England and New England. It doesn't happen so much in continental Europe. or into people making a pact with the devil and giving him their souls and then doing harm. So there's different strains of kind of what's going on economically, what's going on in terms of religious ideas and cultural ideas. And the final thing, I suppose, is about the nature of neighborhood interaction. One theory that was posited is that we're seeing a change, I guess, as life is becoming more capitalistic. There's a shift towards thinking we don't need to provide for the poor in such a direct charitable sense as we have before. And so many cases involve a kind of poorer widow, for example, coming to the door of a richer household and being turned away or inadequately helped at a time of need. And then, understandably muttering something under her breath as she leaves. And then that gets seen to be a curse. And it's a projection of one's guilt in that circumstance for the householder gets understood to be aggression on the part of the person being turned away. But that also happens. I'm reading this fascinating book called The Ruin of All Witches, which is just coming out in November. And it's Malcolm Gaskill looking at a case in the 1650s in Springfield in Massachusetts. And there it's between neighbors, but it's between neighbors of a similar economic status, but the same themes of envy and guilt and fear apply. So I think it's a whole bundle of things.
Well, that's so interesting. And the idea that, yes, you mutter something as you leave, and then if by chance something bad happens to the household, it's because of the muttering or because of that transference of guilt or worry or whatever. And I wonder if we look at the accusations, because in addition to the accused being predominantly women, the accusers not so much predominantly women, but we do see women making these accusations. We see witches who are being interrogated, then accusing other women often. So can we talk a little bit about some of that breakdown? I just wonder about the women's networks, that sometimes work and sometimes don't work in modern society. But can we talk a little bit about neighbors and women who are accusing women or being accused by women and what you make of that?
I suppose fundamentally the idea that women, and especially women who have sort of served their function, as it were, in societal terms, who aren't producing children anymore, are witches, is it's patriarchal, it's deeply misogynistic. But there's never been a time in history when patriarchy has just been upheld by men. Right? Women have always been complicit in that. And I think there's a large extent to which women could be defined as respectable by being involved in accusations against other women as witches. In England, and again in New England, one of the things that is believed is about these familiars, these creatures who are demonic, who will suck on a witch's mark, or some sort of teat generally found by examining the body of a witch, and they're normally found in what they call the secret parts, so the genitals. And those examinations are carried out by respectable matrons in the towns. And, there's something sort of pretty awful once one thinks about the violation that took place for that bodily examination to happen, and the way in which that was done to prove someone else's guilt. And actually quite often what they're finding are signs of age, frankly, things like cervical polyps and things that will happen with a woman,
right,
particularly postmenopausal, particularly if she's had children. And the women are being punished for being women and for being older women, but they're being punished just as much by other women as by men.
Okay. Yeah. And I just find that so interesting, because I think when we, maybe initially think of witch hunters, we tend to think of men. But in fact, much of the accusations and much of, as you say, the interrogations, the very physical and invasive and just so, terrible investigations were done by women, which is really kind of horrifying when you think about it.
And you're right also about the accusations, that these are coming from women's worlds of working together. It's women who are baking together and sewing together, spinning together. That's how they socialize most of the time. Life is, for the most part, in the 16th and 17th centuries, apart from one's marital unit, divided into gendered circumstances, because men are often going out to work in fields. I mean, women do that as well, but only at certain times of the year, harvest times, for example. Quite a lot of the time they're going to be maintaining their house. They're going to be sitting on their doorsteps, spinning whilst they talk to other women who are sitting on their doorsteps. So there's quite a sense of female camaraderie, going down to the communal bakehouse together or sharing an oven or whatever. And so a lot of these things are going to be arising from women's interactions.
Right. And that's just really a fascinating component of it, I think, when we talk about the envy that's at the heart of some of this. That really opens a new window, I think, into some of these interactions and some of the most frightening carrying out of what envy can do when left unleashed at all. So I want to shift just a little bit now to talk about a couple of the very well-known, both an accuser and an accused, but not really accused, people in the world of witchcraft. And I think of you as my Tudor, and especially Henry VIII and his wives and Anne Boleyn go-to. So I'm really intrigued by the whole association of Anne Boleyn with witchcraft, because we know it was not part of the indictment against her, and yet it is so often associated with her. And there are these legends of her having 6 fingers and all of these other disfiguring marks. And how do you think that happened? And how has it, taken such hold for Anne Boleyn?
I mean, it really has taken hold. Everybody says it. And people generally are quite surprised that it isn't one of the things she's charged with. She's not charged with being a witch. And as you say, it doesn't feature in the indictment at all. It features in 2 places, which is why I think it's come about, that it's remembered in association with her. It was still a bit mysterious how it's quite so dominant. But there is one moment where the imperial ambassador from the Holy Roman Empire, Eustace Chapuis, says that someone has told him that Henry said to someone, so it's at least third hand. It's a real sort of Chinese whispers. And Chapuis is writing this letter in French as well. So there's a sort of translation question, because Chapuis doesn't speak English, so we don't know exactly what Henry said that he then records. But anyway, there's Henry has apparently said that that Anne had bewitched him, so that she had used sortilège, which is the French for sorcery, to win his heart. Now, obviously, we literally use that phrase, she's bewitching, or she bewitched me, to mean exactly that, right? To mean nothing to do with witchcraft at all, but somebody is just very appealing. Mm-hmm. It could also mean, in a very similar construction, she was enchanting, right? It's the same idea. So we don't know whether Henry is actually making any reference to witchcraft, or whether this is just a phrase, because we don't have it firsthand. We've got it through so many sort of through so many refracted sources, and because we don't know exactly what he said in the first place in English. So that's one place. And then the other place is, there was a Elizabethan writer, or a writer, perhaps I should say, someone writing in the age of Elizabeth, a Catholic, yes, called Nicholas Sander, who hated Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, and who wrote about Anne Boleyn. And what he wrote about her seems to have been disproportionately powerful. He's the one who said that she had a 6th finger. Mm-hmm. And he also said that she gave birth to a shapeless mass of flesh. And the scholar Retha Warneke has argued that the shapeless mass of flesh was a deformed fetus, and that this was associated with ideas about witchcraft, which, to be perfectly honest, is really not something I've come across in all the things I've read about witchcraft. Deformed fetuses are sort of not a major feature of witchcraft belief anywhere in either England or Europe at this time. So it's an unusual thing to ascribe to witchcraft, as particularly as actually Anne has miscarried at about 3.5 months. So sort of by definition, it's going to be a relatively shapeless mass of flesh. Sorry if that was too gory, but
Right.
so anyway, but these are the reasons why Anne has become associated with it, and I think in the end, it boils down to actually what Henry was trying to express, that Anne was too attractive. She was too charismatic, too appealing for it to seem natural. And so something had to be, some explanation had to be given for her appeal.
Well, that makes sense when you consider Henry's behavior over that time and you look at the letters he wrote to her. He almost became a different person when he was so in love, just so given over to his emotions over that period of time. I wonder if he might have, looking back, been almost embarrassed and thought, oh, well, she was too much. It was just too much. Too much attraction, too much appeal, too much something, but that doesn't make her a witch. So why has that stuck to her, do you think, so dramatically? You know, a third or fourth hand mention of Chapuis, and then this, you know, Nicholas Saunders is so, she's described as so unappealing physically. I can't imagine anyone who's studied Henry VIII at all thinking he would have spent a moment with someone with all these deformities that Saunders attributes to Anne Boleyn. I just don't understand how that would have stuck so strongly.
You're absolutely right. I mean, the whole thing's a little bit of a mystery, except insofar as it's just a very interesting idea. I think that we are still obsessed with witches, and we sort of always have been. And we are in different ways, perhaps to the way people were in the 17th century or 16th century. But I think that, you know, people just care about them. And I went to this wonderful little conference. I was very lucky to go in person to something recently, which was to mark 50 years since Sir Keith Thomas's Religion and the Decline of Magic, a really important book in thinking about witchcraft. And there was a paper that was given there by Will Pooley that was thinking about witchcraft beliefs in 19th and 20th century France. And it's really struck me powerfully because he was talking about the tissue of doubts and how we think about witchcraft belief perhaps too much when we need to think about both belief and doubt. And the example he gave was of villagers in the 1970s. So a French villager saying, je sais bien, mais quand même, which is like, I know well, you know, that witchcraft doesn't exist, but all the same. And it struck me that bears lots of resemblance to, say, how people might talk about ghosts today. Yeah, of course, I know ghosts don't exist, but I still get that weird feeling when I go in that room or whatever. And so I think that there has been a kind of cultural, collective legacy of witchcraft. It's something, it just hangs around. And so people, yeah, of course they don't believe in witches, but they sort of, there's sort of a frisson, you know, there's something that still is produced when you talk about witchcraft that makes it engaging. Anyway, so that's a long way of saying I think that we're still kind of, we still care about witchcraft, and therefore it's something that's just too sort of sexy and exciting not to stay attached to, frankly, one of the most sexy and exciting women in history.
Well, that makes a lot of sense, sadly, but that does make a lot of sense. And it also makes me think, if you look at how it travels from, and I'm thinking of James the First and the times in first Scotland, and then he brings it sort of with him to England a little bit. And then his ideas from his demonology are taken over to the United States. Well, they weren't the United States yet, the colonies, and the trials there. Can we talk a little bit about that? Because I think James, although he wasn't necessarily calling for this massive anything goes approach, what he wrote sort of led to that interpretation of the use of torture and sleep deprivation and disorienting these women so much that they were beginning to claim all kinds of things. So what happened there, and how does it travel, across the water to the colonies? Can we talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So James wrote in 1597, or at least it was published in 1597, his Demonology, which was effectively a sort of manual for identifying witches, and a recommendation to exterminate them. And it's challenging skepticism at the time. So there was always skepticism, there was always doubt, as well as belief. But here you've got a reigning monarch who will go on to become King of England as well as King of Scotland, saying, witches are real, and this is how you find them, folks. This is what you look out for. And so among the things he suggests is, for example, swimming a witch, which is a sort of water ordeal where a witch is stripped, her or his thumbs are tied to her or his to their toes, and then they're put under the water by ropes. And you know this one: if they float, they're a witch; if they sink and drown, they're innocent. They may not drown, but most of them would have done. So there's a process by which it's thought that James says the waters of their baptism will, eject them if they have made a pact with the devil, which is what witchcraft is starting to be believed to be, not just the doing of harm by magic, but also actually a diabolical pact. Being a diabolical pact, it means it's going to be something that the Puritans are kind of worried about. So we get in England, Old England in the 1640s, we've got the Witchfinder General Matthew Hopkins and John Sterne and others operating in particularly Puritan areas of East Anglia and Essex during the time of the anarchy of the Civil War. But of course, already by that point, there had been, and over the course of the 17th century, there would be about 25,000 people going from England to what would become New England, who were Puritans who were fleeing the old country and trying to build a promised land, which was, of course, going to be more exacting when it came to matters of morality and diabolical temptation and the censure of others. And so many of the ideas that they took with them were, purely British, both Scottish and English ideas about witchcraft, whether it comes down to the familiars I've already mentioned, the swimming a witch, how you might deal with them in terms of things like sleep deprivation. And a lot of those ideas you can trace back to James's Demonology. And it's exactly what people are reading. This is the sort of, there are laws of witchcraft became a crime in England in 1542, but that's reasserted in 1563, 1604. And the Massachusetts Law Code picks up on this and makes it a crime for someone to be conversant with a familiar spirit. So, basically the diabolical pact is a crime under law in New England as well as in Old England.
Right. It's just so fascinating to sort of watch that. And as you see it, and you think of the Salem witch trials, and I've heard discussions where they sort of say, oh, it sort of came out of nowhere, but it doesn't. You can really trace it back to what was going on in England and Scotland beforehand. And as you say, came over with them when these people came to what would be New England.
And actually, this is why the book I just mentioned earlier by Malcolm Gaskell was so important, because it looks at a case from the 1650s that's tried in Boston. And there are lots of other witch trials that happen in New England. It's just that the Salem is the biggest and involves the most people and has the most notoriety. So it's not coming out of nowhere. And as you say, it already has these long roots stretching back across the Atlantic.
Right. Yes. And Salem sort of got the notoriety, but it's certainly not, unique. I mean, there are some ways in which it is unique, but it is not the only pocket of this that you see. And it is quite fascinating that that's part of the building of this new, better nation, was that belief that came with it. So it's really all quite fascinating to me.
It certainly is.
And we get into, and I know you've thought and written about some of the ways that currently some modern women, maybe particularly young women, but modern women are using new means of communication to self-identify as witches. So through the internet, through social media, hashtags, all of those kinds of things, we see women sort of claiming witchcraft as a means of empowerment.
Yes. And actually, what's interesting about this, I think that it's possible that that it was always that, really, in some ways. I think some of those women who confessed to witchcraft before had found it empowering as well. But yeah, there's a very interesting thing going on at the moment, in that we find that on Instagram and on TikTok and all over the place, even Taylor Swift and her album Evermore, people are, and certainly in the publishing industry, people are kind of producing a lot of stuff where they're talking about being witches, and some of it's political. So we, had quite a lot of sort of referencing to hex white supremacy and hex the patriarchy and all that sort of stuff coming out. And there was witches who were suggesting that they would put a spell on Donald Trump. I don't know if you remember that. But there's something about reclaiming the identity of the witch as something feminist, as something that is kind of about female empowerment, and as suggesting that it's a sort of reaction to the patriarchy, I suppose, that this is exploiting like women's inherent power. And so it's interesting because I think quite a lot of it comes on about how we see magic. So magic today can be understood to be actually not just the kind of summoning of evil spirits, but what we might call affirmations, or spells are prayers to the universe, or it's engaging with nature as a kind of natural magic, or it's making remedies which are from gathering herbs and things like that. So some of it feels like it's about self-care, and attached to perhaps the idea about doing yoga and meditating and looking after one's self mentally, and some of it seems to come from a concern about engaging with the natural world, and worries about climate change, which obviously it's very serious and real worries. So I think there's all sorts of different ingredients in this particular cauldron, that are bubbling up here. And of course, there's also, wherever there's interest, there's going to be capitalism as well. There's going to be people trying to make money out of selling stuff to do with it.
Right. Well, and I wonder, you see stones and crystals and all those kinds of things sort of with that magical element, smells as well. I'm just thinking all of the oils, and I don't know, it just seems like there's a real interest, or maybe a reliance on that, or a turning to those kinds of natural things, and that idea of magic.
And I think, sorry, go on.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think some of it comes down to the fact that what it means to be a witch is so capacious. So it's, on the one hand, there's the reclaiming of the language of being a witch, and actually we see this in all sorts of ways in we live in an age of identity politics, and so much of it comes from like the word, reclaiming the word queer, or even if you go historically, frankly, the word Protestant was an insult. The word, like the people often take a name that has been used against them and use it as a symbol of their reclaimed power. And so witch is used in that regard, in sense of being a reclaimed name about how women were treated in the past. But because we are also living in a relativistic age, no one can tell you what a witch is or isn't. So you can say you're a witch without that necessarily having to mean what your neighbor might mean if they say they're a witch. Or so it has this kind of sense in which people can claim to be witches without agreeing on the definition of what a witch was or is.
That's really interesting. And it just, so as you said that, I just made the connection with James and his Demonology saying, here is what a witch is. And now that you know that, we can hunt them and eliminate them. And the notion that there is power in saying, no, we can redefine and reimagine that term to mean anything or what we want it to mean instead, and the power that comes from that. The resistance to being defined.
Yes, although funnily enough, I mean, the what a witch is or has always been a problem, because the reason we get this sort of upsurge in cases, and another reason is that the elites believe, right, the authorities have to validate what people say when they come along and bring this accusation against their neighbor. If they dismiss it, it doesn't become a trial, it doesn't become a prosecution. So, and one of the things is that the elites are seeing it, as I mentioned, as often this kind of diabolical pact. But that's not necessarily what, ordinary neighbors are saying when they see that. Sorry, my dog barking in the background. That's not necessarily what ordinary neighbors think of each other. They're just thinking that some bad is happening, that harm is being done. So the definition of what a witch was has always been contested and always problematic. You're right, absolutely, that James is kind of producing this kind of way of categorizing, and that helps. It's a sort of manual. But even in the 17th century, it was difficult to say exactly what a witch was.
And that continues. And that's just really, I think, an interesting and powerful part of that. So what is a witch is a question that we'll probably continue to grapple with.
I should think so. Yes. And I think that we will continue to do so, because in part we're still, introducing children to the idea of witches at a very young age. My 2-year-old can point out a witch in a book. And so it is an idea that gets lodged with us pretty early, and which we then have to confront.
Right. And yeah, and that's interesting, because the whole use of fairy tales to do that is quite fascinating. Yes, as you say. Well, thank you so much for all of these thoughts and great insight into this ever evolving and continuing discussion in our society about witches and what it means and what it is, and how to maybe understand it. So I really appreciate that. Now, I know you have a lot of things you've been working on and have coming up. Can you tell us just quickly what's next for you? What are you working on now? And where can our listeners find you to learn more about your work?
So I am working very slowly on a biography of Henry VIII's queens. Never been done before, completely new. No, I feel like there's new perspectives to bring to them, and new evidence and new research. So I'm writing that at the moment. People can find me. I'm on, all the usual social media outlets, where, as you said earlier, I'm at 16th written out, and then a C for century, and then girl, which is becoming more and more problematic as I get older. Anyway, but there we go. Hostage to fortune, hostage to time, which is what you expect of a historian. And otherwise, look me up on Not Just the Tudors, which is from HistoryHit, and you can just get that wherever you get your podcasts.
Great. And I will, of course, include links to all of that in the show notes. Well, thank you so much, Suzannah. I just so appreciate your time and your insight and taking a bit of it to share with us, and wish you all the best in all you're doing. We love not just the Tudors and everything you do. And I, for one, am just, there's already a place in my bookshelf for your biography of Henry's Queens. So I'm looking forward to getting that. And I'm waiting eagerly for What is History Now to hit the States as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, and I have enjoyed our conversation so much. I'll come back anytime you'll have me.
Oh, well, great. Count on it. Many, many thanks to Professor Suzannah Lipscomb for sharing her time and expertise with us today. I really appreciate her. And I appreciate you for listening. Please continue to listen, subscribe, like, and leave a rating if you're so inclined. I really appreciate it, and it means the world to me. And I'd love it if you'd check out our new Patreon page and become a member of the Royals, Rebels, and Romantics patron family. And let's keep shaking up history together.